A lot of people have recently asked me about the yeshiva students being conscripted into the army, and why is it that they don't go to the army? Should they be going to the army? What is our perspective on that? Well, what is my perspective on it? And so I just want to share some of my thoughts about it, which are really just to put some ideas on the table. This is a very large subject which touches on many, many different things. But just some thoughts that we can consider. But even before I share what we, some of these different ideas, I do want to say 2 points. Point number one is this is a very, very emotional issue for certain people. And I understand that it's a very emotional issue for certain people and certain families who have paid a very, very heavy price through having family members in the army. And I want to say at the outset that when we are dealing with something very emotional, sometimes we shouldn't even be having this conversation. We're just not in a position to have this conversation. And if that's the case, I ask you to just stop listening, because I understand when people get intellectual and intellectualize something that's very personal and emotional, it's very hard to hear it. That's the first thing I'd like to say. The second thing I'd like to say is that much of what is driving this entire debate on both sides tragically is what some people would call politics, or I would just say simply agendas, without bringing as much honesty as we can to the subject. And that really ruins the entire conversation. And I'm going to say that much of what's going on in Israel on this, and the reason why this doesn't get resolved, is for that reason. And I'll acknowledge that it's very hard, it appears to me, for both sides, I'll say the religious side and the secular side, to bring the level of honesty that is required in this conversation, to acknowledge certain things, right? To acknowledge certain things, and then again also to present your position. And I'm going to try and cover some of these agendas just so that we can see what's involved with this entire subject. But at the core of it, we need to understand one thing from a religious and spiritual perspective. And that is that we need an army. There's no question that we need an army. However, the reason why we need an army is for the same reason that Moses led the Jewish people into battle. Moses and King David he was a warrior before he became a king. He was a shepherd before he was a warrior. He was one of the greatest Torah scholars of his time, right? He had this fascinating combination similar to Moses, to Moshe Rabbeinu, Moshe, our great teacher. We had armies. We always had armies. You needed a physical army. But the reason why we need a physical army is because God tells us that we have to operate in this world according to the normal way that this world operates. God designed this world to follow nature, and even though God makes supernatural things happen, he generally, other than open miracles, creates his miracles through nature. And that nature is to have an army. So we must have an army. And that, however, that doesn't require much education. Most people understand that we need an army because most of us are first and foremost entrenched in this world and the worldliness, and our immediate perspective is to do what the physical world demands of us, what nature demands of us. But the more novel side of this is that we don't only need an army. We need something else as well, which you can refer to as an army as well, but we'll call it the army of God, which is we need spirituality. We need a strong connection to God in order for our army to be successful. And so from a religious, now I understand that not everyone will get this, but what I do ask is that if you are not religious, to get that religious people believe this very deeply. And I believe this very deeply. I believe all of our success comes from God's blessing our efforts, and that when we are living out the purpose that God put us, the Jewish people, here in this world for, then we have far more blessing than ever before. And there are many, many examples of this, and arguably the war in Gaza right now is an example of this, because many people who assess what's going on in Gaza many military experts will state that the level of casualties that are occurring in Gaza are far lower than, for example, the United States experienced when they were dealing with somewhat similar situation in Iraq, where their fatality rate was far greater than Israel's is. Why is that? That is because we are God's people, and we are aligned with God to the extent that we are, and God is, without a question, blessing our efforts. And that doesn't take away from the greatness of the army and the absolute self-sacrifice, what we call Mesirat Nefesh, that every single soldier who is part of this war is displaying. And for that, the merit that they have for that is unmatched, even by those who are studying in yeshiva. Yet at the same time, we need to be spiritually empowered just like we are physically empowered. And that spiritual empowerment comes in large part from the fact that we have thousands of our people who are constantly studying Torah, which brings spiritual protection to the soldiers. And many of the soldiers feel this and believe this, and many don't. And that's irrelevant really to the subject. But this is very clear to a spiritual perspective and to the Jewish people. And in fact, as the Lubavitch Rebbe wrote in many letters, if you look at the history of the Jewish people and you want to understand what is the secret to the survival of the Jewish people, we can take a very scientific approach. And that scientific approach is looking at the common denominator that existed amongst the Jewish people during all periods of history that we had, which would be the secret to our survival. And that is our connection to Torah and mitzvahs. Because we in fact find that any group that separated themselves from Torah and mitzvahs in the way that God gave it to us at Mount Sinai, eventually that group disappeared from the Jewish people. They sort of got lost in the world. So we see that the Jewish people clearly are very deeply intertwined with the spirit of God and the spirit of Torah. And that's why this is very important. Now, this doesn't answer all of our questions, but at least now gives us a framework to discuss this conversation within. In the same way that we know that a body is deeply impacted by, the physical body is deeply impacted by the mental state of the person. Right? You say, what does one thing have to do with another? They are deeply connected, and we know that many of man's ailments actually come from stress, from emotional stress or mental stress, right? They're deeply connected. In the same way, our spiritual service of God is deeply connected with our physical service of God. And the army is representing a particular form of physical service, and the yeshiva students are representing a particular form of spiritual service, both of them very powerful in their fields, and both of them actually very important. So you have, in the same way you have, the intelligence corps of the army. They're not on the battlefield, but they're critical and crucial to the army. Likewise, we have yeshiva students who, from a spiritual perspective, are crucial and critical to the success of the army. And they determine, in their way, in their participation, how strong the army is going to be. Now, God designed the world in a very interesting way, where there's rich and there's poor, and the Talmud discusses this question of why did God create rich people and poor people, right? And the answer is because God designed the world in a way that everyone plays different roles in the world. And then together, we actually work together with each other, and therefore we bring out the wholeness. And each side always has certain advantages. In fact, the Talmud says something astounding, that when a wealthy person gives charity to a poor person, helps out a poor person, the poor person is doing more for the wealthy person than the wealthy is doing for the poor person. Or another way of example, which is a little bit closer to our discussion, that is that there were two tribes amongst the 12 tribes of the Jewish people, Yisachar and Zevulun. And Yisachar and Zevulun made an agreement. Zevulun, they were people who their portion of land in Israel was on the Mediterranean, and they were sailors and they were merchants and very successful. And they made a deal with the tribe Yisachar. Yisachar, you study, we're going to be the business people, and we're going to support you, and we will share the merit. I will share our wealth with you, and you'll share your merit of Torah study with us. And they created this pact, which worked beautifully. And what's fascinating is that very often we find in the Torah that the Torah mentions the tribe of Zevulun before the tribe of Yisachar. The business people before the Torah, the ones studying Torah. Because there's an element of virtue that the business people have, which is even greater than the ones studying Torah. And this is what the soldiers have, which is even greater than the ones studying Torah, is that they are living al mesirat nefesh, which is one of the deepest, most powerful ways that a person can live. And that's why every single soldier, it has nothing to do with religious or not religious. The very fact that they're going to protect the Jewish people and putting their life on the line makes them the holiest of Jewish people. Very powerful. I know this doesn't appease in any way, but I'm just trying to shed light on the importance of having both of these segments amongst the Jewish people. Now, if there is a yeshiva student who's not truly dedicated to study, to Torah study, and is just puttering around in order to get what they call in Israel patur, an exemption from going to the army, that's problematic. That is problematic because they are not fulfilling their share fare for the people, and they should be going to the army, right? At the same time, and that's very important. For there needs to be introspection within the religious community, and I have to say that in my community, which is the Chabad community, there are far more members of our community who do participate in the army when they are not fully engaged in the in yeshiva, in Torah study. However, at the same time, I do want to say that there are many religious people who do participate in many other ways in society. In the society, both collecting body parts, working with Zaka. You might be familiar with these organizations where whenever there's a terrorist attack, or they were very, very heavily involved after October 7th, and also with events in the army where they are literally on their hands and knees collecting blood and just small pieces of bone to make sure they get buried properly because it's so sacred according to a Jewish tradition. The Magen David Adom is filled with many, many religious volunteers and workers, all different types of rescue services that they're involved with. So there is participation. But of course I know that doesn't satisfy the question. I just want to put that out there so we create a full picture. And there needs to be more participation by those who are just seeking a way out. That is actually a very problematic. And the reason why so many participate in these other segments is because of the values they have learned in yeshiva. Now there is also a program that the Army has called Hesder with certain yeshivos where the yeshiva students learn part-time and then they go into the Army. And I heard from a general directly that these students are very often the very powerful battalions in the army. Why is that? Because they are very passionate, because of their Torah study and their belief in the land of Israel. It gives them a level of conviction which is very, very powerful, which actually enhances their participation in the army. But here's the challenge that the religious have going to the army. And that is that when there's also honest introspection on the secular side and on the army side, very often there are agendas in the army to secularize religious individuals who come into the army. There's a long history of this. And if the army is going to come and say, or the state is going to come and say that the religious have to come to the army, at least have the integrity to show up and make sure that there's an accommodation that accommodates the needs of a religious person. If King David was able to have a religious army, then we can have a religious army today too, meaning that not that the whole army has to be religious, but that at least the religious that are coming into the army are fully accommodated, and that their concerns about negative or wrong influences from the army should be dealt with so that they don't have to deal with those influences, and that there is no agenda to secularize the religious. So on both sides, there needs to be far more integrity showing up. The religious have to have integrity in that we don't just use this as an excuse for all religious people. Also, not to have a chip on our shoulders that we are holier than you, because we are not. We just play different roles in the entirety of the fullness of the army that we need, which is an army that has a spiritual and a physical battalions. And that the secular makes sure that they are truly accommodating the religious in a way that they can not violate their values, which can absolutely be done. And they will have very strong battalions, because the religious are people of very strong conviction, because that is the way they are raised, with a very strong religious conviction. And when were this to be done, this would be very, very helpful. The truth of the matter is that this, we have to bring honesty and openness to this conversation. And the bottom line is that we pray to God, that God bless His people with peace, and that this become an irrelevant conversation, because we actually, God shows the fullness of His blessings, and we no longer experience war in this world anymore.